Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're going to do a viewer question show. We have 5 questions for this week's show, and I think they're all pretty interesting, and also I should say quite diverse. So we'll cover a lot of different kinds of ground, and I think it'll prove interesting and instructive. All right, well, our first question comes from Chess Enthusiast, and he says this. Says he has a question about the Benko declined, and declining it with 3e3. So he says this: the openings which arise are totally unfamiliar to me. I can play e6 and d5, which seems to be some queen's gambit, or I can play g6, which he says is more his style, but this means I play more like a Grunfeld. The question is there a drawback of the white setup? Can I transpose to some favorable black setup against d4 because of the early e3 move? Thanks. Well, Chess Enthusiast, I think that there are a lot of good options against e3, and you kind of allude to, I think, the right way to handle it, which is when you have your parenthetical comment about something being more your style. So really, I would say, whenever possible, if you're, let's say, faced with an unfamiliar opening approach from your opponent, you should try to find something, if you can, that fits more with what you know, with what you're comfortable with. So there are a lot of ways that black can play this position. One, as you said, is to play e6 and then go for d5, and you end up with either a favorable version of the semi-Tarrasch or the Tarrasch, sometimes something else, but basically this is not considered to be a terribly difficult line for black to play. Black has very good results here, and I think both theory and practice confirm that black is in good shape. But there are certainly other ways to play. Another way to play is C takes d4, E takes d4, d5, which transposes into the Panov-Botvinnik of the Botvinnik variation of the Caro-Kann. So normally we get there like this: e4, c6, d4, d5, takes, c4, knight f6. So same position through 2 different move orders, and at this point in time, at least, the Panov is not considered to be especially dangerous for black in the Caro-Kann. So this can certainly be recommended wholeheartedly as well. And then a third approach, as you said, is with g6. Now here you can go for both a Grunfeld approach, but you don't have to. So there's flexibility here as well. After, let's say, knight f3, bishop to g7, knight c3 castles, white has to make some kind of decision. If he plays d5, you might be able to slowly but surely arrange for some kind of Benko gambit anyway, where white has not really played for the most principled variations. So let's say bishop to e2. Well, here I think black has several good ways to play. One way to play that is often good, but I think not really so great here, is b6. And the reason I don't really like it here is because I think d5 is a very effective counter, and now I think white is probably slightly better. But 3 ways that are quite good: there's Grunfelding it with d5, as you suggested, and really, I mean, white's setup is very, very, very slow, not very forceful at all. I mean, let's compare this with the regular Grunfeld. So g6, knight c3, d5. Well, here white's main approaches involve going for this big pawn center, or we're playing bishop to g5 or bishop to f4. So we've got several important moves here. So the most principled approach is with c takes d5, e4 takes and takes. And here, of course, white's got this nice big pawn center. Black is going to take his cracks at it. He's going to try to show that these pawns are in grave danger of being overextended. But anyway, that's the battle. This is a principled approach for white. Another important approach for white is with queen to b3, or let's say knight f3 first, bishop to g7, queen to b3. So again, here white is going for this big pawn center after castles. Sometimes bishop to f4 is played, but e4 is the main move. And now here black has all kinds of possibilities: a6, knight a6, bishop g4, knight c6, and so on. But again, white is going for the center, going for control of the board here. Still another approach after knight f3, bishop to g7, is to play bishop to g5. So this is also important. Further, going back here, another interesting move. Well, there's bishop to g5 here too. There's also bishop to f4. All right, well, so compare all of this with what we have in this position. So the bishop on e2 is passive. White isn't playing e4. White's bishop on c1 is inside the pawn chain. So I really can't see any reason at all why this would be a Grunfeld that black should fear. I mean, if black is afraid of this position, then black has no business playing the Grunfeld in any position. All right, so that's one good way to play, perfectly good way to play. A second is c takes d4, e takes d4, d5. And this is basically transposing again to a Panov-Botvinnik system with black. But I think a version that should be perfectly fine for black. I mean, bishop to e2 is really not a terribly incisive approach. It's not a way that really puts severe problems to black. So this should be good. And then finally, if you like a King's Indian, well, you could play d6 here. And again, white's setup is really not very enterprising at all. So this should be quite good as well. Okay, so in short, I think there's really just nothing to fear at all from this Benko declined, with e3 anyway. And again, just head for the kind of opening that you would like to play other than a Benko gambit in any case. And you'll get a favorable version of it, I think. Okay, on to the next question. This is from Raghav Ramesh, or Rags to Rooks, to use his handle, and he says this, quote, "My question is regarding the game given below. After my blunder on move 40, I had to try and take a decision on whether to give up a pawn or the exchange. I felt that my best practical chance was to give up the exchange, but then try and keep the position closed so that his rook wouldn't be able to penetrate into my half of the board. Of course, a few moves later, f takes g5 wasn't the smartest execution of that strategy, but overall, was the idea correct in principle? Or would I have been better off giving up the pawn on g3 and trying to hold?" All right, well, here's how this came about. So Rags to Rooks had white here. Black has just played rook from b to e8. And here he blunders with rook to f4. Okay, so I guess he was trying to prepare maybe knight f3, I'm not sure. But the problem with this is that after knight to h5, there isn't any way to protect the g3 pawn without dropping the rook. So what should he do here? Should he give up a pawn? Should he give up the exchange? Well, here's kind of how I think about it. If I had confidence that after giving up the exchange I could keep the rook out in the long term, or if I had some other concrete compensation, if I had a pawn for it, if I had a great outpost, if I had a passer, something like that, then I think going for the exchange sack would be pretty decent. But here in the game, I don't really think you can keep him out, and the light square bishop is bad, and his knight on e5 is going to get back there. So here's how the game went: king f2, knight f4, g takes f4, knight to d7, and all right, the problem is black is going to play g5 and then bring the knight to e5, and after g5. Even if white were to play something like f5 to try to keep lines closed against the rook, still the knight goes to e5, the king goes to f6, black plays h5, rook to g8, g4, and so on. And he's bound to break through sooner or later. So in the game, white made it a little bit easier than he had to, but it's really tough to stop it. So g5, and I don't know what white's supposed to do. I mean, king g3, I guess. But again, you just take, knight goes to e5, king goes to f6, rook goes to the g file, and black is going to break through sooner or later. So, all right, in the game it wasn't very difficult, but I don't really think it could have been that difficult, even with the most resourceful play by white. So something like this is going to happen sooner or later. You can see that the rook breaks in, and all right, that's a nice, elegant way to finish it. So going back to the beginning here, after rook to f4, knight h5, I guess it's better to play rook f2. I mean, I'm not optimistic about white's position here either, but I think it's better to be just a pawn down than the exchange down. And in particular, I think you want to keep your rook on the board. I think that's maybe the most important aspect of this, because your minor pieces in this ending really seem to have no scope at all. All right, and they wouldn't have had scope even if this G5, even if you were better prepared to face F takes G5. So anyway, that's how I would put it. I mean, if you were getting something concrete for the exchange, if you had a really compelling blockade, if you had an outpost, if you had a pawn for the exchange, if you had a passer, something like that, it could be worth it. But with basically nothing for it, and no activity either, I mean, that's really important. I mean, so you don't have a fortress, and you don't have any counterplay. So I think it would have been better to just stay the pawn down. And even though your position there is probably losing in the long run too, I think having at least one piece that could become active, namely your rook, would give you more chances to resist. Okay, on to the next question. All right, this is from TRW, who's a pretty strong player, 2,000 rated player, or thereabouts. And he says this. He says, I have a serious problem. One so serious that I might actually be forced to quit chess over it if I can't solve the issue. So I'm coming to you for advice. My question pertains to momentary blackout blunder lapses I seem to encounter routinely. The pattern I have identified, but the cause and solution I can't. I haven't got an inkling. Basically, I play quite strongly, far above my rating for almost the entire game, until I have these momentary lapses once the position becomes extremely elementary, winning or drawing for me. Then I will make a colossal blunder by making a move that I didn't even analyze. An example, and I can give you countless more. Here, I was black, and it's my move. I've analyzed the obvious and forced only move, c5, to draw. But for some unexplainable reason, I played king to e6, where right after b5 I had to resign instantly. It is infuriating. To preempt the obvious inquiries, no, I did not move too fast. No, it is not a lack of knowledge, as the only move that occurred to me in the position was c5. I had not even analyzed king to e6. It is beyond me why it appeared on the board. Okay, so that's his question. And I can sympathize, and not only, let's say, as a fellow human being, but as someone who had a period where I experienced something a lot like that myself. So back around, I think 2000, 99, 2000, something like that, there was this period of about 3 tournaments in a row where it seemed like every game, somewhere in that game, I would have some fairly serious oversight or other. Somehow I survived a lot of them, but still, I mean, I threw away a bunch of half points, and certainly it just frustrated me no end. And what I had to do was just stop playing in tournaments for a while. So, I kept looking at chess and playing blitz and having fun with it. But as far as tournament play went, I mean, I think I stopped playing for about 6 months at that point. And this was in a period where I was playing really regularly. So I don't know what causes it. I mean, I suspect it's some kind of problem with attention where I don't know. I mean, it strikes me as maybe somewhat similar to when people transpose words. So you mean to say one thing, you say something else, or you invert a syllable, or let's say you're looking at the board, you mean to say knight f3 and you say knight f6. I don't know. I mean, I suspect that these are just the sorts of funny little brain malfunctions, something like that just happen every now and then, even to young people who are in perfectly good physical and mental health. At any rate, what can you do about it? So I would suggest a couple of things. So one thing is, if nothing works, maybe just stop playing in tournaments for a while, or play a little bit less. Sometimes you can just get glutted, and I think that's a possibility. Another thing that you could try, and this I think is practical in an over-the-board context, maybe write down your move first. So, I know a lot of trainers have suggested that over the years as a way for people to avoid blundering. So that I think can sometimes be useful. I don't do that myself, but a lot of people over the years have kind of sworn by it. So that might be of some help to you to try doing that. If you write down the move before you play it, you look at the move, I think that'll at least help with the blunder in this game where you just randomly played king to e6. Another thing that sometimes happens, although I don't know if that was the case here, but I've done this before, and I've read about it happening to other players, including grandmasters, where let's say you'll analyze some variation, and somewhere in that variation there'll be the move. Let's say in this case, king e6. So you might have looked at c5, b5, king e6, or calculated king e6 in a lot of lines, and perhaps in effect it sort of overwrote the c5 part of the program. So you would sort of looked at c5 and you were calculating things, and then king e6 was maybe one of the last moves you looked at within that variation, and maybe you just sort of skipped c5, sort of mentally jumped over the first move. So I've seen that happen before. Anyway, those are maybe some very small pointers, both of an explanatory and of a practical nature. So I hope that they help. I wouldn't panic too much about it. I mean, I know it's incredibly frustrating, but probably worst comes to worst, you take a little bit of a break from tournament chess, and probably whatever's causing it will go away. All right, so let's go on to the next question. This is from Peter Joak, or Peter Joak. I'm not sure how he wants to say his handle. Anyway, he writes this, and he's a Class C player. So he says, I heard that Korchnoi favored playing the exchange French as an isolated queen pawn position, or isolated d-pawn position. So he gives the following as an example, c5. And I'll note on my own, so me being Dennis Monokroussos, not the person submitting this, that Korchnoi also liked to play this isolated pawn approach against the Tarrasch French. At least he did on many occasions against Karpov in the 70s, with reasonable success. I mean, he didn't win any games, but he also didn't lose any there either. Okay, now back to the question. So he says, it seems that this approach should translate reasonably well to the Queen's Gambit declined. And he says, the following position seems no worse than anything that comes up in the Queen's Gambit declined Tarrasch, and the computer claims it's almost equal. So the line he gives is this, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6. Okay, so we have the exchange here. And here, instead of, let's say, c6 or knight b to d7, c5, and then on dc, knight b to d7. All right, so what he writes at this point is this. He says, this is just one variation, but the basic idea is to meet bishop to d3 with c5. If white delays the capture, so back here, black continues with rook to e8 and knight to e4, as in the Lasker. Actually, I wouldn't really call this the Lasker, but, well, I know he's not calling it that either, but yeah, I mean, it's just a standard Queen's Gambit decline motif. Anyway, continuing with his question, it goes without saying that black must be willing to accept the weak d-pawn, but I take that over the mainline minority attack variations any day. Strangely, I've never seen these lines in any of the opening theory research that I've done. Is that because authors assume that black would have played the Tarrasch if he wanted an isolated queen pawn? Or am I overly optimistic about black's chances here? All right, well, I would say, well, before I get into any kind of specifics here, let me say a couple of things by way of preliminaries. First of all, I think the minority attack is it's a significant approach for white, but I think it's also pretty well worked out for black, and nothing that you need to fear. It just takes some research. So to the extent that you want to just take kind of a labor-saving approach for those rare occasions maybe where you see the exchange Queen's Gambit, maybe it's practical to play like this. But I don't think that the minority attack approaches by white really need to be feared, but they do need to be studied. Okay, so that's first. More specifically onto the kinds of positions we're looking at now. I think it's very important to distinguish between, let's say, active isolated d-pawn variations versus passive ones, versus defensive ones. So let's consider the regular Tarrasch here. So c4, knight c3, c5. C takes d5, e takes d5, knight f3, knight c6, g3, knight f6, bishop g7, bishop b2, bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, castles. All right, so now white has two main moves. There's d takes c5 and bishop to g5. But in any case, in all of these Tarrasch lines, black gets pretty active piece play. Both of his bishops get to good diagonals most of the time. The knight can often go to the e4 square, which is pretty good. And the e-file can be an asset. So the play tends to be pretty lively, and black has a fair amount of tactical tricks and resources at his disposal. Compare that with, let's say, this old school mainline Tarrasch French. So knight g to f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, bishop to d6, takes, castles, knight g to e7, knight to b3, and then the bishop either goes to b6 or more commonly to d6. All right, and then, okay, white does various things. Rook e1, bishop g5, h4, g3. But generally speaking, this was really very, very solid. Well, it's very solid for black, but also very solid for white. I mean, white really is in no danger at all here. I mean, black has no attacking chances to speak of in this variation. And indeed, Korchnoi didn't play it really going for, let's say, in trying to play for a win against Karpov in the many games where they tested this line. Rather, he was playing it as just a very solid, stable kind of variation where, in exchange for the d5 pawn, he has basically good active pieces, and that one weakness is not by itself enough to lose the game. And so he never did. They were just all draws, but often he was being pushed. I mean, it wasn't always easy for him in those games. So the Tarrasch Queen's Gambit decline, on the other hand, this is at least it's much more lively. I mean, Kasparov, early in his career played this with great success. Now, he lost some games to Karpov in this line, but it wasn't really so much the opening that was at fault, and he managed to beat everyone else. I mean, he beat Korchnoi with this. He beat I'm trying to think if he beat Bilyavsky, beat Larson with this. I mean, a lot of great players. So, but this is anyway a livelier isolated d-pawn kind of opening. Well, it's not isolated yet, but it's about to be. Whereas the French one is quieter. Now, the reason why I bring all of this up is that this is, I think, a solid one. It's not a very enterprising one. So after, for example, something like knight g to e2, knight takes c5, and now either bishop to c2 right away, and then maybe knight to d4 next, or castles, bishop b6, knight to d4, queen b6. This is probably a good move for black. Rook b1, rook a to c8. I don't think that white really has much to worry about. I think, well, black is quite active here. I mean, black's pieces all get to good squares, but I'm not really sure what it is that they coordinate towards. So anyway, I would prefer this bishop to c2 version, and it really doesn't seem all that threatening. So it's very solid. I don't think this is a bad line that you're suggesting, and it's been played a few times. I mean, if you look in the databases, you'll find it, but I don't think it's dangerous to white. So I think if white plays fairly accurately over the next, let's say, 5, 6, 7 moves, it's going to end up as essentially a two-result kind of game. Either white slowly but surely grinds black down, or it ends up a draw. But I think black has, again, unless white does something wrong, where black plays with tremendous energy over the very next few moves, I think it's going to be the sort of position where black just has to grimly hold on and get his draw. Now, one other thing I want to say by way of comparing one variation with another. So back here, instead of knight to f6, it's very popular nowadays, and well, for a long time, but I think especially now, to play bishop to e7, which prevents white from playing this Carlsbad plan. So let me go back to here. Bishop to d3. Let's say knight b to d7, queen c2, c6, and now, okay, knight f3 is standard, no big deal, but knight g to e2 tends to be a fairly annoying line. It gives white this option of playing in the center with f3 and e4. So by playing bishop to e7, it thwarts that. White can't get bishop to g5 and knight to e2 in. Can't get both of them in. He's got to give up one or the other. So generally it's knight e2 that bites the dust, and we get this sort of position. Well, here black has played knight b to d7 and then c5. This occurs sometimes. Or let's say castles, bishop d3, c5, and again here too, knight b to d7 approaches can be seriously considered. But this, I think, is a little bit easier for black to play because white's bishop is on f4 rather than on g5. So the version that we're looking at in the question, I think, is a little bit easier for white to play. The point being that with the bishop on g5, it prevents the black's dark squared bishop from getting active. And of course, there's also this indirect pressure against the pawn on d5. So I mean, there are tricks already kind of in the air, like bishop f6, knight takes d5, because on queen d5 we have bishop takes h7 check and queen takes d5. Now, it doesn't work right away because black has bishop takes b2 instead of queen takes d5. But the point is, there are tricks like this that are available, and with the bishop on g5 hitting the knight on f6, black's d5 pawn is a little bit weaker, which means that he probably has to play something like bishop to e6 sooner or later, which makes that bishop kind of passive too. So all in all, I think that it's playable, certainly. I don't think there's anything really wrong with it. I'm not sure that white has, let's say, an obviously, when I say a clear edge, it's not clear to me that white has an edge or a distinct and tangible edge. But if anyone is better, it's white. And I think, again, black has to play very actively. Otherwise, he can end up really with a prospectless middle game and ending. Okay, so enough about this. Let's move on to the last question du jour, and this time we're going to have an ending. So this was played in a simul, so this was submitted by Joanna, or Ms. Nono, and she says this. So I played a game against an IM. It was a simul that he held on ICC. I played black and did okay for a while, then everything went wrong. What could I have done better? Which move was the key move for losing an okay position? And finally, would there be a better way to progress this game in the end? All right, so here we have a position after the queens just got traded. So we had this, and her opponent, Voja or Voya, had probably Voya, was white, and she had black. All right, so in this position, maybe white is a tiny bit better because the pawn on e5 is isolated, and it's not so much that that pawn is weak, although it could become weak, but also that the e4 square is a nice perch for white's king. So because of that, white is probably just a touch better, but really this should be a draw with accurate play here. All right, well, let's take a look at a couple of moves here. King e2, king e6, rook f1. All right, so this is all very logical. And now here black played rook to e7. And this, I think, is not really the best move because it's inviting rook to f8. So we're giving something away here. So black has to decide what it is she's going to do. Very often, there's a strong tendency, almost a compulsion, to do something, anything. But here, it isn't really clear that black has to do anything. Perhaps it's good to find something useful to do, but it's not immediately evident what it is that white's going to do. There's really just one plan, I think, that white has. Well, okay, maybe two plans. So one idea is to play g4, g5, and then attempt to penetrate with rook to f6. And let's say black's king goes back to the 7th rank somewhere. Well, okay, e7 makes the most sense. Well, then white will bring the king up, and there'll be pressure against this pawn on e5. So that's the one big idea. A second idea is to play rook f3 and try to start harassing black's pawns in this way. And maybe even from there we can activate and try to bother pawns over here too. So something along this line. And basically in both cases we see that the plan involves white activating the rook. If white's rook doesn't find some approach into black's position, there's just nothing to do. Black can just sit and do absolutely nothing and draw. All right, so with that in mind, let's think of some plans for black. I mean, there's just sitting patiently, but sooner or later, white will try to do something. Now, one idea here that might be interesting is h5. So this stops the g4 plan, and of course, it takes any threat out of rook f3, h3. Of course, white could still play rook f3, g3, or rook f3, h3 to play rook to h4. But anyway, h5 is a possibility. A funny idea is to play rook to b8 with the idea of b5. This may not be so bad, but I'm not going to look at that very carefully. So I'm going to look at, well, two moves here. So rook to d8 is the first move, and then I'll look at rook to c8. Okay, so let's start with rook to d8. Against this, white should put the plan in action, g4. Now, black has a point too, rook to d6. So black is going to go for counterplay against white's weak queenside pawns. So let's say g5, threatening rook to f6, king e7, which stops that and cuts off the f8 square as well. King e3, rook a6, b3, rook b6, rook to b1. So black has managed to keep white restricted, or at least keep the white rook restricted, but still black has some problems in this position. So king d6, king e4, king e6, h3, king d6, rook to b2. Okay, and we can just kind of go back and forth, but now white can spring into action. So this is, again, just an idea. I mean, it's not that black has no way of improving in this variation, but it is showing some of white's resources here. So a5, rook b5, takes, and now a6, c4, rook f2. Again, threatening rook f6, followed by king takes e5 here, which would be winning. So let's say king e7. Now rook h2. And black is going to lose just about every pawn. So black should be losing this ending. So not only does black have to find some kind of active plan, she needs to find a better one than rook d8, d6, b6. So that looks like it doesn't really lead anywhere, and white can slowly but surely improve his position. Okay, well, I think a better move may be rook to c8. This might be black's best. All right, well now, if g4, then c4. So this is the idea. And on g5, rook to c7, black seems to be just fine. It's an unclear position, but I think black is okay. So let's try b3. All right, well now the difference here is that black is a move faster. So rook to c6. So g4, g5 is not ready yet. Okay, now if rook to f8, rook b6, black is in great shape here. So white should probably play king to d2 and king to c2. All right, but now king e7, rook f3, and here a very interesting move which seems to work. You've got to be extremely careful about this, but I think it survives here, is rook to f6. Now, black could play a move like h5, and that should be fine as well. But rook to f6, if it works, it's great. So takes, king d2, king f5, king e3. And now if white's king gets to e4, he's in very good shape, but black can stop this. g5, h3, h5, king f3, g4 check. So black is just in time, and just in time is good enough. And black has to give ground, but after king f6, king e4, king e6, white has no more tempo moves, and he has to go back, and this is a draw. Actually, maybe white can even be in trouble here, so maybe king to e4 is not so brilliant. All right, so yeah, I mean, white maybe should play king f2 or king e2 and meet king f5 with king e3. All right, so I think rook to c8 probably holds. All right, instead, rook to e7, rook f8. Okay, well, black is, white has made a little bit of progress, but I think black is probably still holding here as well. Now, black played a6 in the game, and this I don't really like. It's still not fatal, but I kind of don't like it, because after a5, this pawn is holding up both pawns, both the a and the b pawns, and black's queenside pawns have lost their flexibility. They're immobile. So I think a better move would be b6. So the rook still covers the pawn on a7, so either way, all the pawns are taken care of. But black still has the possibility of playing a6 and b5 at some point. Further, I would say that it's economical to have each of these pawns protecting its neighbor. So only the a7 pawn needs to be supervised, but you can see basically as much as possible, black's pawns are self-protecting, self-sustaining. And that's generally a very handy thing. Okay, another move that could be considered, it's risky, but I think it works here too. I wouldn't bet my life on it though, but I think it works, is again rook to f7. Now, if the white rook quits the f file, excuse me, then black, black has definitely benefited from getting the file. All right, so let's take a look. Takes, king e3. Now, it might be that a5 is better, so you might want to try to work that out on your own. But let's say king to e3, b6, king e4, king e6. Now, the thing that's good for black in this position is that white doesn't really have any immediate zugzwanging ideas, because this g6 pawn covers f5. So black can just go to d6, e6, d6, and so on, without ever worrying about king f5 because the pawn is covering it. All right, so white needs to have some other idea. So g4, king d6, h3, king e6, h4, king d6, and now d4. This is the idea. Creating more breakthrough possibilities for the white king. But after a6, it looks as if black can keep all of the exits sealed here. So c5 is covered, b5 is covered, f5 is covered, and the king can take care of d5 and e5. I said all the exits. I should say all the entrances are covered. Okay, so after rook to f8, black played a6, and I think that again makes the job a bit tougher. I'm not sure if black is losing yet, but it's a step in that direction. So a5, and now rook f7 is too late. So she didn't play that, but let's see this. So takes, king goes up. So same ideas. Now h5. And now after all of these exchanges, it's losing because white has tempo moves in reserve, and of course with the pawn stuck on b7 rather than on b6, the white king isn't kept out at all. It's going to go to c5 and b6 and grab. So I think the cleanest win for white now is b3, king e6, king e4, king f6, king f4. Okay, and now if king e6, white has one tempo move left over, and that's what he needs to win. Or if g5, king e4, king e6, b4. And now the black king gives ground, and he loses the g-pawn either way. All right, so rook f7, not good. Better is rook to c7. Again with the idea of playing c4. Now white should play b3. Let's say king e7, rook h8, king d6, king e3, rook f7. Certainly black can still resist here, but white has made progress. Not only is the rook in, but the h-pawn and especially the b7 and a6 pawns are vulnerable as well, and the e-pawn. So I think all of these weaknesses put together means that white has excellent winning chances at this point. Still, I think this might be what black should have played. One other idea, though, actually, and this is, I think, another very interesting idea. Here, black could consider the move b6. So this is, I think, kind of a neat try, going for activity right away. So after rook to a8, b takes a5, rook a6, king f5. You might like to play king to d5, but there's a small drawback, namely mate in 2. So king f5, rook a5, rook to b7. Now here rook to a2 is really just too passive. You shouldn't make moves like that. After e4, alright, obviously white's better no matter what, but black has, I think, reasonable chances to hold, or at least is going to make it very difficult. So rook takes c5, rook takes b2 check, king f3, king e6, and black has some drawing chances. Probably is losing, or sorry, she's losing in the long run, but definitely a lot of play still. I mean, it's a lot of work. Black's rook is very active. It's well posted on the second rank. White has one passed pawn, but it's not a very dangerous one. So I think black definitely has reasonable, has drawing chances to be sure. All right, so finally let's get to the game. King d5 is what happened. White played king e3. Here, maybe black should again consider rook to c7, but okay, king to c6. So this I don't like just because it's a voluntary retreat to a square that's not really very good. The threat's to play king to b5, but after c4, the king has lost ground without really any need. And white is getting to make these useful moves with gain of time too. All right, now c4 does have one drawback, and it's that of course we can't play this d4 plan anymore, but probably white isn't going to need that. All right, now here black has the last chance to stay in the game. It's pretty tough, but you do what you can. King d6, and then king e6, and still white has to prove it. Okay, so rook to d8 check is very useful here, because if king to e6, then rook to d5 wins a pawn and will win the game. So king c7, rook d5, king c6, rook e5, and now rook f7. And here at least black's rook is ready to break in. And again, there's some drawing chances. There's some counterplay here. So of course, white is better. White's up a pawn, but it's not just white gets to do whatever he wants to, and black just has to sit and suffer. Black gets to have some fun of her own. All right, well, not in the game. In the game, unfortunately, black played b6, which may have had the idea of playing rook to b7 that I mentioned earlier. So from back here after a5, b6 was kind of interesting, but now it doesn't work because of rook f6 check. And here black resigned, and appropriately so now, because after the b pawn falls, either the a or the c pawn is going to fall. The e5 pawn is vulnerable. Black's king is going to be passive. So it's all in all no real chance for black anymore. So very interesting endgame though, and we can see that really the battle was to see who could most successfully activate their rook. White was able to do so and activate the king somewhat as well, while black's rook stayed passive for far too long, and as a result, bad things happened. So that's, I would say, certainly one of the absolute keys in playing a rook ending correctly. Almost always, it's super important to activate the rook and then activate the king too, and usually in that order. All right, so that'll do it. Very good batch of questions, and I hope the next batch is just as interesting. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.